All right, committee. So we talked about having a presentation on annexation of property. We're very pleased to have Mr. Chris Meyer from Gibbons Pursley be here with us today. We also recognize a couple of the bill sponsors who will be considering, that's in the audience there, Senator Lakey and Representative Young. I know Doug Okonowitz is the other one. I'm not sure if he'll chime in or not, but committee, as you know, we do have some property tax annexation legislation, some bills to be heard. A couple of them are competing a little bit with each other, and Mr. Meyer has graciously agreed to come and visit with us and discuss some of the history. And you do have this land use handbook here. Depending on how good you are, we may or may not have a pop quiz at the end of the committee hearing here, but no, just kidding. But we do appreciate Mr. Meyer. Would you please come forward, please, and introduce yourself, and then the time will be yours to go over your presentation. And committee, if you do have questions along the way, if you will please let me know, and Mr. Meyer is graciously willing to answer those questions as he's going through his presentation. Senator Schroeder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to clarify, this is just one small chapter in the entire land use handbook of Mr. Meyer's law firms. This is just the part on annexations. Yeah. So it's quite a book, and we in the business use it quite a bit, and we really appreciate Mr. Meyer bringing it. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for providing this as part of your textbook. So, Mr. Meyer.
Chairman Rex, Vice Chairman Schroeder, members of the committee. Am I coming through? Is the microphone working okay?
I think you're good. Sometimes if you can pull the podium towards you if it's too far away.
There we go.
It'll slide.
Maybe that's a little bit better.
Okay.
Well, thanks to all of you for having me here today. It's a real honor to be called before this committee and to have a chance to speak to everyone here, and as well as to be with members of the audience that have an ongoing interest in these important issues of annexation and areas of city impact. I did, as the chairman pointed out, hand out copies of an excerpt of the land use handbook. I'm the principal author of that document, and yes, it is, the real one is a number of hundreds of pages. And if anyone would like one, I'd be happy to bring as many copies as you would like of that, and you can paper your walls with it. But that handbook is an ongoing document. The version that I handed out at the bottom says printed today at 1:46 p.m. I've been editing it since about 7:30 this morning, and I cannot look at it without changing it, because I find that what I thought was clear the last time I wrote it 2 years ago, I go back and think, what was I thinking? Why is that not clear to me today? So it is my effort to try to communicate what the state of the existing law is today, and I have attempted to do that in a way that is even-handed, because this handbook sits in a lot of courtrooms throughout the state, and I have to live by it, whatever case I'm living with. So I can't change my mind from day to day and say, well, today it's black, and the next day say it's white. I have to write these things based on the way I take it. Now, there is one caveat in here on page 105, and there's a little caveat that says, note, the issues addressed in this section are now in litigation. The author represents one of the litigants. It's slightly dated. I should have said was recently in litigation, but you may recall I was before this committee almost exactly a year ago, last March, at a time when there were a lot of people that were hot and bothered over a conflict between the city of Middleton, which is a client of mine, and the city of Star, and there were other conflicts bubbling up here and there. I'm happy to report that that particular issue, which did go into litigation, has been resolved. So that is a former litigation, and as a result of that conflict and legislation that was proposed last year that would have resolved that litigation, frankly would have resolved it in the favor of the city of Star. The committee pulled back as many of you know. I guess there's been some musical chairs since last year, but many of you were here then, and the committee selected Senator Lakey to lead an effort to come back and see if he could bring the parties together. And I must say, when I sat there and watched Senator Lakey raise his hand and says, "Well, I'll give it an honest try," my feeling was, good luck, because that's a real challenge. But by golly, he has really put his nose to the grindstone and brought a lot of people with very sharply conflicting and differing viewpoints on where things ought to go, and he's worked with them very hard for a year, and I think he's made some very good progress. But the result of that is one of three pieces of legislation that I understand the committee would like me to speak to today. And I do want to emphasize that I'm going to do my darn best. I've been instructed by the chairman and by the vice chairman to be even-handed today. And, you know, I may have some personal views. I do have personal views. And I have a client that has an interest in this, but I'm going to try to put on my law professor hat. I used to teach law before I went into private practice, and in many ways that's where my heart is, because I think it's really important to be able to lay out what the options are, different ways of looking at things, and allow people to evaluate those pros and cons. And so that's the hat I'm going to be doing my best to wear today. So please call on me if you think I'm not, and feel free to say, well, hey, are you really telling us the whole story? And I'll do my best to get back on that track. I also really want to encourage everyone to interact with me during this. I don't really have much in the way of prepared remarks. I'm just going to kind of be winging it here. And so if I'm not winging it in the direction that is helpful to you, please send me to a helpful place. So the three bills that I understand you would like me to address today are S1062, which is the Young and Van Orden bill, and that's the bill that replaces all of the annexation statutes, 50-222. It completely takes it off the books and then starts from scratch with a much shorter version. The second is S1073, which is the Lakey bill. That is what I would call the compromise area city impact bill that reflects the efforts that grew out of this committee's efforts a year ago. And the final one is S1040, the Econowitz bill, which also addresses the ACI overlap issue. And it's a bill that is spectacularly efficient in that it consists only of 2 words. Now, has anybody ever been able to beat that score before? But it only adds 2 words to an existing statute and says, we're done. Now, let's begin, unless you want to send me in another direction, with S1062. That's the Young Van Orden bill that would replace 50-222. Now, one of the really attractive things about that piece of legislation is its simplicity. In contrast to the existing 50-222, which is enormously complex. Now, that's both good and bad. I mean, simplicity is a beautiful thing, but it also can be a dangerous thing because, as all of us know, the complexities of legislation, particularly legislation that has been with us for a number of years and become part of the understood law and become part of the investment strategies of private property owners as well as cities and counties, those, even though they're cumbersome and complicated, they sometimes provide an important foundation to allow things to move forward in a predictable way. So I think that's the fundamental trade-off that is presented by S1062. Now, S1062 takes the existing statute, the annexation statute, which was completely revamped. The last time it was completely revamped was 2002. I mean, they started over in 2002, but it's been with us now for, 21 years. And in 2002, they adopted a rather complex piece of legislation that provides for categories A, B, and C of 3 different types of annexation. And if that's not complicated enough, A, B, and C doesn't sound that complicated, does it? But if you look at each one of those, each one of them is enormously complicated within that. And then there are all these exceptions and convolutions that make it a complex bill. So before discussing the idea proposed in the legislation, which is essentially to jettison that approach, maybe it would be useful to just take at least a brief look at what the existing statute looks like. Now, the existing statute really makes my head hurt. I mean, it is really, is there anybody that has read that statute and thought, what a magnificently drafted piece of legislation? I immediately understand the whole universe of what they are trying to accomplish. I doubt it. Every time I have to read it, I have to spend 3 hours getting it all back into my head. And then when I do that, the only way I can keep it in my head for more than 10 minutes is to make a chart. And so that chart is included in this land use handbook. Let's see if I can flip forward to it. It's on page 82. By the way, I have what? A couple more of these. If anyone dares to just want to say, I need that more than somebody else, help yourself. So this chart on page 82 is my effort to take the entire statute 50-222 and explain what these 3 different categories do. And where to start with this? I think maybe one place that we ought to really spend some time is on the issue of consent, because I think one of the driving motivations behind the legislation, and by the way, I don't know the sponsors of the bill, and have not, so I'm not speaking from any sort of an insider's perspective or a political perspective. I'm just speaking as, a former law professor who looks at a piece of legislation and tries to figure out what's going on. But the thing that jumps out to me is it seems to be aimed largely at saying we want to virtually eliminate the concept of an involuntary annexation. And that is in contrast to the existing law that does contemplate that there are going to be involuntary annexations. Now, at some point, and maybe now is a good time, we need to focus on the question of how important a problem is that in Idaho. And I'm not going to tell you the answer to that, but I'm going to at least suggest some ways of thinking about that. There were times in the past when involuntary annexations happened with at least some regularity. And by involuntary, I mean what the word sounds like, which is where the city says, we're going to annex this piece of property, notwithstanding the objection of some or all of the landowners in the annexed area. By the way, I had a colloquy with Vice Chairman Schroeder before the meeting where he gave me a little bit of a tutorial on constitutional law, and it was instructive. I'm digressing to comment on it, but it is kind of a good introduction, which he was pointing out that the law is settled, that there is no constitutional right of a landowner not to be annexed. In other words, the concept of an involuntary annexation is not constitutionally problematical. It may be problematical politically or in terms of your sense of what is the right policy, and certainly the legislature has the power, irrespective of the Constitution, to limit involuntary annexations. But we should understand that we're having a policy discussion here. This is not a flag-waving constitutional discussion. It would not be correct to say we must eliminate involuntary annexations because they violate either the Idaho or the federal Constitution. They just don't. But so we're having a discussion about what is best for Idaho. And Idaho, since 2002, has had this very complex mechanism that allows some involuntary annexations. In modern time, these involuntary annexations have become very few, extraordinarily few. I have done some polling of other lawyers engaged in land use practice, and people scratch their head trying to remember the last time they actually saw a successful involuntary condemnation of land. One of my law partners today brought to my attention that there was one in Boise 9 years ago, and that's the only one that he or anybody else in my firm could think of. And they're presumably, probably we've missed some, and there may be some in other outlying areas, but it is not something that happens very often. And so, one of the questions that we, or at least that you, I think, should be asking is, do we have a problem that demands fixing? And if so, we need to make sure that we fix it in a way that doesn't have unintended consequences. So maybe we could spend just a moment looking at existing law and thinking a little bit about it and comparing that with the approach of S1062. Now, S1062 essentially says that there aren't going to be, the only involuntary annexation is going to be if 2/3 of the property owners within the area to be annexed, and it must also include at least 50% of the land area. In other words, a supermajority vote in favor of annexation. My sense as a practical matter is that is essentially saying that there will be no annexations ever again, no involuntary annexations ever again in the state of Idaho. I mean, 2/3 is an extraordinarily high number. So the effect of the bill would be significant in terms of restricting the ability of governments to do these involuntary annexations, but we have to balance that with what I just said, which is they don't do very many anyway. But it is a tool that they have in the extraordinary circumstance that they might need it. Now, the S1062 bill does carve out an exception for enclaved residential properties that can be annexed without without consent. And it has to be fewer than 30 of them. Now that bears some relationship with existing law. If you look at this summary chart, you see under Category A, that's one of the three types of Category A annexations in existing law, which is that you can have enclaved residential property of fewer than 100 parcels may be involuntarily annexed by cities. So basically, the new bill preserves that, but reduces the number to 30. So is that just good enough? Well, to me, that raises a troubling issue because that is not the only mechanism for dealing with enclaves in existing legislation. This Category A annexation basically just allows the city to move forward with it. So, and I do want to make sure everybody understands what I mean when I say enclave, that, sometimes you have these annexations that are just proceeding kind of in piecemeal fashion. And for one reason or another, maybe there was some farm or something in the middle that there was no development on and it just didn't get annexed. And now all of a sudden, right in the middle of the city, you have a part that's not in the city. And it becomes inefficient in terms of providing services, both sewer and water and police and schools and everything else, when you have a bunch of people living that appear to be in the middle of the city that are not in the city. And so this is aimed at dealing with that. The difficulty comes down to one word: residential. The Category A is for enclaved residential property. But if you look at the existing statute under B, and both B and C, and you see there's a big area where it says and it says, divided into lots of 5 acres of less, and then it says, or annexed land is completely surrounded by the city. Now, what that means is that's not limited to residential. So you can't do a simple Category A annexation of non-residential enclaved property. You've got to jump through some really big hoops because Category B and Category C have a lot more expensive bells and whistles that the city has put through. They can't just adopt an ordinance and call it good. They've got to go through a full-blown process of undertaking studies and everything else, but they can do it. Now, why does that matter? Well, what if you have not just some homes that are enclaved in the middle of the city, but there's also a gas station or a school or something else? Well, under existing law, that means, well, you can't do it under Category A, but at least you can do it under Category B or C. Whereas under the new approach, the proposed approach under S 1062, can't do it at all unless you get the 2/3 vote, which is another way of saying you can't do it at all. So that is an example, I think, of where we need to be really careful that you take this god-awful, complicated, existing statute that just drives us crazy to try to understand what it means, and the temptation to replace it with the simplicity of this alternative, which I love. By the way, it is beautifully drafted. I mean, this is an elegant piece of legislation. I'm not making a joke or being facetious. I mean, it really is. It's one of those pieces of legislation where you can read it and understand it, and that's not always the case with legislation. But before we go there, I really urge the committee to slow down and really look at every aspect of what the existing statute does before you say, well, we just don't need that whole bathtub. Let's throw it out. We need to know what babies are in that bathtub before we empty the wash water. And there may be some babies other than the one that I just mentioned, which I think, the ability to resolve these enclaves is really important. And then, of course, there's, the larger substantive question of, are we really comfortable that we're just for all practical purposes, never again going to have an involuntary annexation. Now I need to do a segue here to Senator Lakey's bill. It looks like there may be a question, Mr. Chairman.
Question, Senator Schroeder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Meyer, so I wasn't sure how much farther you're going to go on 1062. I had a question about the former statute, the existing statute, not yet former, 4B2, and in your book, or in your handbook, you say something about implied consent. Statute defines written consent as follows, and then it talks about the act defines implied consent. Do I keep doing this or something? It defines implied consent as in category in B and C, valid consent is implied of all lands connected to a water or wastewater collection system operated by the city if the connection was requested in writing by the owner, or if the owner's authorized agent, or completed before July 1st, 2008. And I guess my question is, it wasn't clear to me whether that implied consent was retained in the new statute.
Chairman Ricks.
Go ahead.
Chairman Ricks, Vice Chairman Schroeder, thank you very much for that question. I had intended to get there, but I failed to, and I really thank you for calling me back to that important point. And that is, and so let's just, well, the quick answer is no. There is no implied consent in the new bill, S 1062. Implied consent is gone. The only consent in the proposed bill is written consent, and it is very vigorously or rigidly defined. So there's no mistaking what it is. You have to get out your pencil and say, I want to be annexed. So how does that contrast with the existing legislation? The existing legislation defines consent in two different ways. If you are talking about a Category A annexation, what we often call a voluntary annexation, that's real consent, and that meaning written consent. And by the way, written consent means consent of the landowner, which might be the developer at the time that the consent was granted, if the developer was the landowner. And if the landowner records that consent, it's binding on successors, meaning the person who buys the house. And so when we say voluntary, at some point it was voluntary, but some subsequent owner might say, oh, well, I never agreed to that. But if he or she bought the house and it was recorded that consent was given to annexation, he or she has consented. But so under the existing statute, a voluntary Category A annexation has to be that real consent, written consent. But categories B and C can be based on implied consent. Implied consent means that I asked for and received city sewer or water. And that's something that, has tripped up landowners because they didn't understand that by asking to be hooked up, that they were implicitly consenting to be annexed. The city, you might well imagine, views that differently, which is we're providing a very expensive service to you, and the way that we pay for very expensive services is to make you part of the city and allow you to share that burden. But private landowners often don't view that, and it has created a lot of controversy. And I think in large part because it has created so much controversy, we just don't see cities going down that path anymore. I mean, other than that one that occurred 9 years ago, and apparently there's one or two that may have actually driven this bill, but I'm told secondhand those annexations have now evaporated. But again, I'm not knowledgeable on that. But I am at least generally knowledgeable enough to know they don't happen very often. But under this new bill, there would be no implied consent at all. And so when it says 2/3, that doesn't mean 2/3 of the people are hooked up to water and sewer. That means 2/3 of the people took out a piece of paper and said, I would really like to be annexed, and I'm signing here. Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, does that respond to the question?
Okay. Thank you. Please continue.
The Bill 1062 does not address, or that is, it doesn't change anything about the overlapping ACI issue that provoked Senator Lakey's efforts and caused us to have hearings on legislation a year ago. By the way, when I say ACI, that's an acronym for Area of City Impact, and it looks like sometimes it's also called Area of Impact, with leaving out the word city, so it might be AOI, and it looks like the new legislation prefers that language. So if I say one or the other, they mean the same thing. Now, let me just back up, and I'm sure everybody understands basically what area of impact is, but let's make sure we're all on board that we have a city with city limits. Cities are expected and instructed by the legislature to anticipate growth outside their city limits and to define an area of impact. And that basically sends the signal to developers, to landowners, to schools, to investors, to the whole world, that that's an area that the city anticipates moving into and providing services. And the dispute that came up last year was whether one city could annex not just into its own area of impact, because that's what cities are supposed to do. I mean, that's the whole idea is you say, this is where I'm gonna annex, and then you really do annex there. That's the way it's supposed to work. But the issue that came up is, can one city annex not just into its own area of city impact, but into another city's area of city impact under a voluntary Category A annexation? And that was what the big kerfuffle was all about. And we could have a long discussion about why that's a good idea or why that's a bad idea. Obviously, landowners that want to be annexed really like the idea of being able to choose which city is going to annex them, because one city may have lower tax rates. One city may have zoning that is more favorable to the type of development that they wish to do. One city may provide some incentive that the other city doesn't provide. So it's very helpful to the landowner to be able to play the two cities off against each other and kind of have a bidding war. On the other hand, some cities really like the idea of having that bidding war because they're the winner. They're the ones that are winning the bids. So there are a lot of cities that say that's great, and then there are other cities that say, hey, we've invested a lot of money in planning, and once we make that investment, not only do we continue to build infrastructure with the expectation of moving there, so we may be oversizing pipes, and we also may be charging landowners fees for them to oversize the pipes, which they are then reimbursed when ultimately the further development occurs around them. So in other words, there's a lot of expectation that is built in to that, and some of that then can be upset when these areas are invaded. And so I've tried to be even-handed here. I'm hoping I'm accomplishing that, and I'm not trying to just give you one side. I'm trying to give you the issues on both sides, and then I'd like to speak to how the Lakey bill has sought to find a compromise to that. The Young Van Orden bill does not address that. That's not a criticism of that bill. I don't think that was the purpose of the bill. And what the Young Van Orden bill, S1062, does is it simply basically copies the language that is in the existing legislation. Now, you might say, wait a minute, I thought you said that the new Young Van Orden bill eliminates categories A, B, and C. That's right. It's all just one short, a couple of pages now. There's no category A, B, or C, but that the concept of a voluntary annexation is still embedded in the new legislation. They just don't happen to call it category A, but it's essentially exactly the same thing. And then it copies the same language in the existing legislation that says it's permissible for a city to annex beyond its area of city impact. Now, the difficulty with that is it doesn't answer the question that we spent a year bashing our heads both in court and elsewhere trying to get answered. What's the question? It's one thing to say a city is authorized to annex outside of its own area of city impact. That's what the law has said for quite a number of years in Idaho. In other words, the basic idea is a city has, it has this, the smaller circle that is its city limits. And then it has a bigger circle around that is area of city, kind of a loop around that. The donut around that is its area of impact. But let's say it's not a loop or a donut all the way around. There are some parts of it where the area of impact doesn't extend. It doesn't go there. And yet there's a landowner that's over in that area that's adjacent to the city limits and says, hey, I want in. I want into your city. I want to pay you your tax dollars, and I want your lovely sewer. And at that point, if it's all voluntary, everybody agrees, I think the legislature envisioned why put the city through the trouble of expanding its area of city impact and then 30 seconds later annexing it. What was the point of that? So it says you can go beyond your area of city impact. Just go ahead and take the land if it's voluntary. And so everybody agrees on that. But where we don't agree is, does that language mean, but you can not only go beyond your area of city impact, you can go into some other city's area of impact. And the existing statute is ambiguous. It just doesn't answer the question, and this new legislation doesn't answer it either. So if the intent is to kick the can down the road and continue to let cities litigate this, that's a great way of doing it. But if the goal is to answer the question, it doesn't do that. So what bill does answer that question? That's the Lakey bill. And the Lakey bill is the Lakey bill is a bill that I think is kind of miraculous in that it brought together people that were just dead opposed to each other in terms, I was describing before how some people really like the ability to, to pick and, for the landowner to pick and choose, and some people are just dead set against that. And so the Lakey bill is conceptually very interesting. First of all, it pulls back, it puts cities on an extremely short leash, much shorter than today. And part of the concern that I think led to the proposed legislation last year that was not enacted is that some areas of city impact are geographically quite large. I mean, they go, well more than a mile beyond existing city limits. And sometimes it takes a very long time for them to actually grow into that. And so the concern was, well, maybe the city has been too greedy, if you will, in establishing this large area of city impact. The Lakey bill ends that practice. It says from now on, the area of city impact will be no more than a mile from the city limits. And then there's a kind of a true-up provision that gets us there if you're beyond that. And, first, I should explain, it says everybody by 1 year from next July, in other words, a very short period of time, every single city has to reanalyze its areas of city impact and bring them into compliance with this shorter geographical limit, but it cuts them a little bit of slack. It's in that first true up, you can go 2 miles. And then after that, it needs to be brought back to 1 mile. So it is a geographically very tight leash that cities are put on. And we could argue whether that's good or bad. A lot of arguments on both sides of that. But that's the solution, the compromise that the legislation came up with. And then what does it do? It addresses this overlapping area of impact. One city invading the other area of city impact in a very clever way. And it does it by saying, we're not going to just view these areas of city impact as, okay, I quote, claimed this land. It's mine now. It's sort of like, that's the boundary of Idaho, and that's the way it's going to be. And instead, it's going to be an ongoing process of constantly reevaluating. Does that really make sense? The idea is, okay, we thought we were growing in this direction, and then we need to come back and evaluate that. And the Lakey bill says you need to do that at least every 5 years. You need to look and say, did we overreach here? And the answer may be, no, it's taken us a little longer than we needed, but no, we didn't overreach. Or, yes, we did. We really can't justify it anymore. We're going to pull that boundary back. Or it may be we're growing like crazy and we need to actually move our boundary back. But it's a constant dynamic process of rejiggering all of these. And moreover, the cities don't just get to do it themselves. The Lakey bill puts the county is largely in charge of this process. And it really shifts that responsibility. So it's the county now that is establishing the area of city impact. And the cities go to the county and say, this is what we think or propose the area of city impact ought to be. And it's up to the county to deal with it. And then it also, I thought, very brilliantly deals with this conflict problem because, we have 2 cities and they both think that they're growing in the same direction and they both may have good reasons for that. But they can't agree. And so if they can't agree, then they both go to the county and they say, okay, here's my proposal. And the other city says, here's my proposal. They conflict. County, you decide. And the county will decide. And there'll be a negotiation process. I mean, that's the beauty of it is we finally have people being told by the legislation they have to talk to each other. That didn't happen enough the last time around. People were not talking enough. And not only do you need to talk to each other, you need to talk, and there needs to be a gun to somebody's head. Because just talking doesn't really do any good unless there's some risk of a consequence if you're too obstinate. And so what's the gun to your head? Senator Lakey's bill virtually eliminates judicial review with a very critical exception. It says if you have 2 cities that go to the county and say, we just can't agree, here are our 2 proposals, the county says, okay, we're picking city A, we think that's the better one, or maybe whatever they pick, they could split the baby and do something else. But whatever they do, if one of the cities says, oh, that was arbitrary and capricious, that was just insane. I mean, did you look at any of the data that we gave you? I mean, the other city doesn't have any sewer there, and we've got one sitting right there, and you pick the other city, you're crazy. What can they do? The gun to their heads, they can take it to court. And the judge can do either of 2 things. He can say, that was arbitrary and capricious and send it back to the county, or the judge can just say, I don't even need to send it back. I'm going to draw the line. So that's the very important, I call it a gun to your head, but it means, that the cities and the county need to be talking to each other because everybody knows that there's a third party, which is the judge, can come in there and decide for them. So nobody can just say, I'm just sticking to my guns and too bad about the rest of you.
Mr.
So
Chairman?
I think that's very clever. And then,
Senator
Mr.
Byrne?
Chairman.
Sorry
Question?
to interrupt your animated
Oh, not at all.
discussion. I loved it. So my question is just to confirm, let's just hypothetically say that you have two cities that are in dispute. I just want to confirm, you could have said this, but I just want to confirm, just for the record. But the two cities were able to come to an agreement on their own. So do they still have to go to the county for a stamp of approval, or are we done?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Berndt, they still have to go to the county. The county is always in charge under this approach. Although, most likely if both cities are in agreement and they go to the county, there's a pretty good chance the county's going to rubber stamp it. But there's I think an elegant consistency in this bill that says the county is in charge of these things. And once the ACI is established, the county is going to determine the zoning, and it's going to administer the zoning in that area of impact. And that's, some of that is existing law, some of that is a little different. But the bill is very clear on that. And so now what we have this 5-year or minimum of 5-year, you can't go longer than 5 year, of constantly re-examining these things and, making sure that these areas of impact make sense. And then what I think is the genius of this legislation is it says, so what we're going to do with the, can one city invade another city's area of city impact? The bill says, no, not during that 5-year period. But if some city sits on its rear and lets 5 years go by and doesn't do its job, now any other city can invade its former area of city impact. So it still puts cities on a very short leash. They can't just say, okay, we've staked out this area and we have it forever. They have it for 5 years, and they had darn well better be building the infrastructure and annexing in that area within a short period of time, because if they go back and they say, well, we didn't really do anything, and the county says, well, we're not going to expand your area of city impact, or they don't even bother to ask, we're now back in a situation where, to use last year's example, Stark can just say, well, I'm just taking it. I'm just taking it. And so that, it's another gun to people's heads, which is it's a good gun to have because it keeps cities on their toes. I think I thought it was a pretty clever way of stitching together, so neither side won. I mean, that's kind of what I thought was the genius of it.
Question, Senator Schroeder?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Meyer, so I was intrigued by this part. Cities and counties should review existing areas of city impact and reestablish them in conformance with this section by July 1st. So we have cities out there that don't have any competing infrastructure, nor is there growth on their periphery. And some took, their future land use map is almost a crayon on a Forest Service map. Says this is our area of city impact. And those have been left alone for 20 years, some of them, and they're just fine. They're absolutely fine. But this would mandate that they've got to go, everybody's got to troop back to the county and start over. Is that what I'm understanding?
Mr. Meyer?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, that is my understanding of the legislation. And one could, I could make arguments that that's overly aggressive, but that doesn't do any good because that's not what the bill says. You asked what the bill does, and that's what the bill does. Now, Senator Lakey is here, and I really would love it if the chairman would just turn to him and say, did Mr. Meyer misstate that or anything else? Because I really, I didn't draft this. The senator did, and I feel a little awkward up here explaining his bill when he's standing right behind me. And I may have made a mistake. And
Mr. Meyer, and Yeah. In this instance, we've talked to the bill sponsors and agreed not to really have a full hearing on it. And Senator Lakey is no doubt taking notes, and we'll address some of these when we get to that point. But I think for the purpose of this informational hearing, we'll just have you continue on there, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did hear him say he didn't hear that I misspoke. So, and all I'm trying to do is characterize the bill, not to advocate for it or against it. But I think that answers the question. Is, basically the bill says, we, the bill sponsors, think that there are a lot of cities with areas of city impact that are way too big, and that's not going to be allowed anymore. And you've got just over a year to trim them back to 2 years, and then sometime within the next 5 years, you've got to trim them back to one. Did I say two? You got to trim them back to 2 miles, and then within the next 5 years after that, you got to trim it back to 1 mile. So it is, when I say cities are on a short leash, I think that's a very short leash. I don't think I need to say anything further on that bill, on the Lakey bill, and I just have a few words to say about S 1040, the Conowitz bill. Now, and for me to say any word seems unfair because, as I said, it's just a 2-word bill. So I've already exceeded the number of words in the bill by just introducing the matter. The Conowitz bill, the Conowitz bill adds 2 words to section 50-222. And it's in that area that I was describing as being ambiguous. The existing language says annexation, it's describing category A, voluntary annexation. It says where all landowners have consented may extend beyond the city area of impact. And he adds into and beyond the area, beyond the city area of impact. Now, I think what the bill sponsor meant to say here is that it can extend into another city's area of city impact. The bill doesn't say that. So I think there may be a drafting flaw here because the way it's drafted, it says that the city may annex into its own area of city impact and even beyond its own area of city impact. Well, that's just the existing law today. And I doubt that the bill sponsor intended to just reaffirm existing law today. So I think what that proposal was intended to do is essentially to resolve last year's litigation by saying absolute free opportunity for the landowner to choose which city is going to annex. If either city agrees with the landowner and they can come to that agreement, the landowner can annex that land even if it is sitting in another area, another city's area of impact. Again, the language doesn't say that, but I think that's what it was intended to say. And you've asked me not to come here and be an advocate for it, so I will not do so. But I will just say that that resolves it in a way that is not reflective of the year-long efforts to try to bring differing viewpoints together. It just takes one viewpoint and says you win 100% and the other viewpoint wins 0%. So that would be a different approach to solving the problem. But it would, assuming this language was cleaned up, it would answer the question. Well, I have blathered on for a long time, and I'm good at that. I can go for another hour, but I don't have anything else that I need to get off my chest now.
Senator Schroeder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had one more question on 1062 that I neglected to ask, and that is on subsection 6 ordinance. So it carves out the voluntary annexation. I can't remember exactly how it did it, but where I've landed is on subsection 6. If all the requirements of subsections 3, 5A, or 5B of this section are satisfied, and the city agrees to the annexation, then the city council shall enact an annexation ordinance. And that gave me pause when I read it, because it appears that if a landowner initiated annexation in 5A comes to the city and says, I'd like to annex into your city, and they meet those requirements, and then I'm not sure what city agrees to the annexation means other than enacting an ordinance, then it appears to mandate that the council shall enact an annexation ordinance when, I think previously in a legislative annexation, it's discretionary on the part of the city. Could you speak to that interpretation?
Mr. Meyer?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, give me just a moment. I want to make certain that I reread this and understand it. Mr. Chairman, I think my best answer is that subsection 6, where it says, and the city agrees to the annexation, was intended to preserve the city's discretion to agree or not agree. So I think the city is not having its hand forced here. And so the landowner could say, please annex me. I'm willing to pay your taxes and live with whatever zoning the county, well, actually, let me pause. Under the Lakey bill, it's very clear that the county imposes the zoning. I don't know that this bill, I'd have to go back and reread it, but I don't recollect this bill dictates.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
I think in 5A, upon determining a proposed annexation meets the requirements of the subsection, the city may initiate, and then it's kind of reflective of the former 222, where you initiate the planning and zoning, establish the comp plan policies, and then the zoning classification of the lands to be annexed. So it looks like the city would do the zoning of the proposed annexation in 5A for a landowner one. I just wanted to make sure that the city retained discretion to ultimately do it, but I think 5A contemplates the city doing the zoning.
I think, Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Mr. Vice Chairman, you're absolutely correct. So just to kind of wrap up there, I think, I don't see that subsection 6 is being problematical. I think it preserves the right of the city to say no, thank you. So there are lots of other things that I've said about this bill that might be problematical, but I don't think that one is.
Yeah. So, Mr. Meyer, I do have a question. In regards to the way we, as a committee, of course, will be hearing these bills soon, and we do appreciate very much your perspective on this. Short, mini class 101 on this subject, on annexations. Do you see any conflict, just theoretically, if our committee chooses to go forward with, let's say, the Oconowitz bill or the Lakey bill, either one, and also considers the Young bill, and let's say we do pass the Young bill and pass the Lakey bill, and an example, is there any overlap that would change the language are we talking about two different sections here?
Mr. Chairman, if the legislature were to adopt any two of these three bills, they would be in fundamental conflict. It would not work to adopt more than one of these three choices. These three choices are fundamentally different choices, and they don't fit together. I mean, one could stay up all night and redraft them to make them fit together, but as drafted, they are at war with each other. Just for example, you know, the Lakey bill resolves the conflicting area of city impact. You know, that is one city invading another in a just interesting fashion that doesn't exist in either of the other two bills. So if you enacted both of them, they would be at war with each other. Have I answered the question? I could elaborate more if that's not clear.
I think so, and maybe another example here. So if we do pass the Lakey bill and do consider the Young bill as well, and so you're saying that there's enough overlap that it would cause conflict with the way they're written because some of those sections that are being changed in both bills are overlapping? Mr. Meyer?
Mr. Chairman, if I could be so presumptuous as to make a suggestion, and that is presumptuous because I'm not a legislator, but one approach would be to adopt the Lakey bill, to enact the Lakey bill, and then take a deep breath and say these ideas presented in the Young Van Orden bill are important questions to address. I mean, the question of implied consent is very troubling to a lot of people. There's a laundry list of important issues that the Young Van Orden bill seeks to address. But I would urge the legislature to proceed in sequence. I mean, the Lakey bill has been subjected to an enormous amount of behind-the-scenes but very important formal evaluation by a lot of thoughtful people and stakeholders. And so people have really thought through the consequences, and the consequences are, in my view, manageable. It's a compromise, but it says, okay, this is another way of doing things. We're going to cut back. We're going to be constantly reevaluating these lines, but it doesn't answer all of the questions that might be presented in the Young bill. But my concern with the Young bill is that it is so dramatic in essentially eliminating the entire section of 50-222 that there's a lot of other stuff in there that I think would be very dangerous to do on a wholesale basis without having subjected that bill to the same kind of intense scrutiny that the Lakey bill has been subjected to. So I would urge going a little slower on the Young bill, and then the Econowitz bill it's just a complete opposite of the Lakey bill. So the Econowitz bill just says there is no compromise. One side wins. So that would be incompatible. The other two bills, I mean, you could take pieces of what the Young Van Orden bill does and then graft those on to the Lakey bill. That would be, I think, a sensible way. I mean, you could take the Lakey bill, enact it, or, if you really felt urgency that it happens this session, you could say, oh, we'll also take out implied consent. I mean, that goes beyond what the purpose of the Lakey bill was. And, sometimes, when we bite off more than we can chew, we end up with legislation that has unexpected consequences.
Sure. Okay, Senator Schroeder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quick, regarding an area of impact in I don't know whether this is a change in the Lakey bill or whether this is the existing law, but you said something about the county setting the zoning in the area of impact prior to its annexation, and the city is left with that zone upon annexation. Could you speak to that?
Yes.
Mr. Meyer?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, under the existing law, there is essentially a negotiation, if you will, between the city and the county over what the zoning is going to be. And they have to agree to what the zoning is going to be, or else there is no area of city impact. In other words, it contemplates that they're both going to enact consistent ordinances describing identical zoning rules, and then the county enforces those. It's the county, since it's outside the city limits, the county enforces them. But there is now, under existing law, there is, this sort of, a negotiation process. And if the negotiation fails, then there is no area of city impact. Under the Lakey bill, we just negotiate the boundaries, just a line on the map, and then the county says, and this is the zoning that will apply. Now, the city can go and have all of the on bended knee discussions that it wants with the county. It can say, well, county commissioners, it's really important that you adopt zoning that's compatible with what we're doing in the city. Because, right at the edge of the city, we have this residential area. By golly, if you zone it right, in the area of city impact, right outside of that residential area is light industrial, that would really mess up our vision of what we're trying to build here. But under the Lakey bill, at the end of the day, the county gets to decide. It's not a negotiation process. Just that's the county decides, and the county will enforce. And so it is a pro-county bill in that regard.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Meyer, for being here. Your expertise has been quite valuable to our committee today. I look around on our committee members. I think I'm the only one that was here last year at the present time, since Senator Groh had to slip out a few minutes ago. Again, very much thank you for your expert input on this subject. Committee, we will think about these three bills. We'll discuss this in a future meeting coming up, and we'll decide which path we want to go forth, because it seems very clear that there are competing ideas amongst the different bills, and we'll have to decide how to navigate that. So, thank you.
I would just like to thank you and the members of the committee. Consider me at your service. If I can answer a question or provide more detailed response, you've got my phone number.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again. So, we've got just a couple of minutes here towards the end of our committee meeting, and we'd like to do an introduction of our new Senate